On July 10, 1943, beneath the cover of a moonless Mediterranean night, the largest amphibious invasion in history up to that moment, Operation Husky, is unfolding on the jagged, sun-scorched coastline of Sicily. At the center of this titanic struggle for the soft underbelly of Axis Europe, two titans of Allied command, Lieutenant General George S. Patton and General Bernard Montgomery, have been cast into an impossible rivalry. But as the landings turn from chaos into a brutal war of attrition, a question emerges that will threaten to shatter the Allied coalition from within. Was Patton's ruthless, unchecked ambition in Sicily a stroke of tactical brilliance, or a strategic liability that sacrificed the greater Allied cause for the glory of a single commander? The atmosphere in the Allied command tent was suffocating, not merely from the Sicilian heat, but from the thickening friction of competing egos. Lieutenant General George S. Patton, commander of the U.S. 7th Army, viewed the Mediterranean theater as his ultimate proving ground. Having been sidelined during the initial stages of the North African campaign, he was determined to prove that the American soldier, under his iron-fisted leadership, was the superior fighting force of the war. Across the tactical divide, General Bernard Montgomery, commander of the British 8th Army, operated with the calculated, methodical precision of a man who believed himself to be the only truly professional commander in the theater. Their conflict was not merely professional. It was a fundamental clash of military philosophy that would soon force General Dwight D. Eisenhower to choose between maintaining a fragile coalition and unleashing a volatile commander whose tactics were as brilliant as they were dangerous. In the early hours of the invasion, the intelligence reports provided to the Allied command indicated that the German and Italian defenses would be brittle, potentially collapsing under a swift, coordinated strike. However, the reality on the ground was far more unforgiving. As the 7th Army pushed inland, Patton's aggressive pace was immediately hindered by the jagged terrain and the fierce resistance of the German 1st Fallschirmjäger Division. Montgomery, meanwhile, found his path toward Messina blocked by a stubborn series of German defensive lines, anchored in the rugged hills around Mount Etna. The promise of a lightning-fast campaign was evaporating, replaced by the grim, grinding reality of a static front. Eisenhower, stationed in Algiers, watched the divergence between his two commanders with mounting concern, knowing that any public disagreement would be broadcast directly into the heart of the Axis propaganda machine. The friction reached a boiling point when General Harold Alexander, commander of the 15th Army Group, issued orders that effectively sidelined Patton's forces to support Montgomery's advance along the eastern coast. Patton, reading the directive, felt the bitter sting of subordination. He believed that the American 7th Army was being relegated to a secondary role, a mere flank guard for the British advance. According to his own private correspondence, Patton began to view the entire command structure as an obstacle to victory rather than an instrument of it. While he did not openly refuse the order, he initiated a series of movements that would push the limits of his authority under the guise of an armed reconnaissance toward the city of Agrigento. Patton's decision to redefine a reconnaissance mission into a full-scale offensive was a calculated gamble. He knew that if he succeeded, he could argue that he was simply responding to tactical opportunities on the ground, an excuse that had become his hallmark. When the 15th Army Group Command realized the scope of Patton's advance, they attempted to intercede. The subsequent effort by Patton's Chief of Staff, Brigadier General Hobart Gay, to delay the decryption of these orders by claiming they arrived garbled and unintelligible remains one of the most controversial moments of the campaign. This was not a failure of technology. It was a deliberate, institutionalized defiance of the command hierarchy. As Patton's forces swept into Palermo, he was not just capturing a city, he was dismantling the existing command structure of the 15th Army Group. By the time the message was finally deciphered, the Americans were already well beyond the limits of their original mandate. Eisenhower was left in a position where he could either rebuke Patton, risking a major scandal and losing his most aggressive combat commander, or accept the fait accompli of a significant tactical success. It was an agonizing dilemma that tested Eisenhower's resolve as a coalition leader. Patton's success at Palermo was undeniable, but the cost to the Allied command's integrity was profound. Beneath this operational turmoil lay the strict legal framework governing the American military. Under the Articles of War of 1920, and specifically the 1943 amendments, Any deliberate disobedience of a lawful order during wartime could theoretically result in severe consequences, including court-martial or even execution. Article 64 established that orders from a superior were presumed lawful until proven otherwise, placing the entirety of the risk on the subordinate. Yet Patton was navigating the gray areas where the command authority of an Allied coalition met the administrative control of national forces. He was effectively leveraging the right of appeal implicitly held by commanders to secure his autonomy while operating under the umbrella of Eisenhower's strategic command. The legal burden of command in 1943 was not a theoretical construct, it was a constant looming pressure. Every order issued by a commander was, by the definition of the military code, a binding mandate. Patton's maneuverings, while operationally successful, risked undermining the very foundation of the Army's discipline. When we examine the Articles of War, specifically Article 96, we see the General Article, which provided a broad, albeit dangerous mechanism for prosecuting any conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. Patton's disregard for the established operational boundaries created a precedent that, had it been replicated, could have resulted in the collapse of the unified Allied command structure. But Patton's defiance was not limited to strategic maneuvers. The psychological toll of the Sicilian campaign manifested in two incidents that would haunt his career. The now infamous slapping incidents. In August 1943, within the confines of military hospitals, Patton confronted soldiers he perceived as malingerers. The incident with Private Charles Cool, suffering from battle fatigue and malaria, and later Private Paul Bennett, suffering from severe combat shock, saw Patton lash out in a display of uncontrolled aggression that Eisenhower would later describe as a threat to the morale and cohesion of the entire Allied force. The medical reports documenting these incidents traveled through the chain of command with alarming speed. Colonel Richard Ernest, the Second Corps surgeon, ensured that the details were passed to the highest levels of the Allied medical staff. Eisenhower, receiving these reports, found himself in a position that transcended the tactical successes of Sicily. He was forced to confront the character of the man he relied upon to lead his most aggressive armored forces. In his formal reprimand of August 17, 1943, Eisenhower did not mince words. "I understand that firm and rigorous measures are sometimes necessary, but this does not justify brutality or ill treatment of the sick." The reprimand forced Patton into the humiliating position of apologizing to the soldiers and the medical staff. It was a moment of profound public and private crisis. Yet despite this, Eisenhower continued to shield Patton from the broader political consequences. In a secret message to General George Marshall on August 24, 1943, Eisenhower argued that Patton's exceptional energy, determination, and unhesitating aggression were assets that the Allied cause could not afford to discard, despite his severe personality defects. This decision revealed the cold, calculated pragmatism that defined Eisenhower's leadership of the coalition. Why did Eisenhower choose to protect a man who had clearly violated both the military code of discipline and the moral standards of the force? Was it purely a military calculation, or was Eisenhower himself a prisoner of the need to maintain the public image of a unified command? As the campaign pushed toward the final objective, the port of Messina, the competition with Montgomery began to take on a life of its own, further complicating Eisenhower's calculations. Every victory Patton achieved brought him closer to the end of the campaign, but also increased the likelihood of a catastrophic rift with the British command. The rivalry with Montgomery was rooted in a fundamental divergence of military doctrine. Montgomery preferred a cautious, methodical approach, heavily reliant on massive coordinated artillery and air support to minimize Allied casualties. Patton viewed this as an agonizingly slow and overly conservative philosophy that favored survival over victory. When Montgomery issued his unilateral request to Alexander for the capture of Route 124, it was more than a tactical suggestion. It was an attempt to dictate the tempo of the entire campaign. The American response, led by Omar Bradley, was one of pure, unadulterated outrage. This was the state of the Allied command as they closed in on the final objective in Sicily, a coalition fractured by deep-seated personal animosities and incompatible operational doctrines. As the race to Messina intensified, Patton prepared his next move, knowing full well that it would likely put him on a collision course with the highest echelons of the Allied high command. The tension was palpable. The potential for a spectacular failure was increasing by the hour. Would the ambition of one man prove to be the final catalyst for a total command collapse? Or would the pressure of the race force the Allied forces to finally, desperately achieve a decisive victory? The situation was reaching an operational breaking point. While the Allied forces were winning the physical battle against the Axis, they were losing the internal battle for a coherent command strategy. The decision of who would reach Messina first became the singular metric of success for both Patton and Montgomery, overshadowing the far more critical mission of trapping the retreating German and Italian forces. As the final phase of the campaign approached, the looming question remained: was this race a victory for the Allied cause, or a tragic, self-inflicted strategic defeat? The race to Messina was not about capturing a port. It was the ultimate realization of the command friction that had plagued Operation Husky from its inception. As the 7th Army surged toward the coast, Patton's tactical maneuvers became increasingly untethered from the collective strategy of the 15th Army Group. The logistical reality of this race, however, was far more complex than the headlines would later suggest. While Patton pushed his armor to the point of mechanical exhaustion, the German forces under the command of Colonel Ernst Gunther Bode were executing a masterpiece of controlled withdrawal. Operation Lehrgang was unfolding under the very noses of the Allied command, a testament to the fact that while Patton and Montgomery were fixated on who would claim the city first, the true objective, the destruction of the Axis forces, was slipping through their fingers. This strategic failure was not a secret. It was a consequence of a command structure that had effectively collapsed under the weight of personal rivalry. The absence of a coordinated interdiction plan for the Messina Strait meant that between August 11th and August 17th, 1943, the Axis forces successfully evacuated over 60,000 men, nearly 10,000 vehicles, and critical heavy equipment across the narrow channel. These were the same veteran units that would later form the backbone of the brutal defensive lines at Salerno, Cassino, and the Gothic Line, prolonging the Italian campaign by 2 agonizing years. Patton's tactical success, reaching Messina 50 minutes before the British, was a hollow victory when measured against the massive escape of the German and Italian fighting force. The human cost of this obsession with speed and status was most tragically realized on July 11, 1943, during the catastrophic friendly fire incident involving the 82nd Airborne Division. Under intense pressure to reinforce the beachhead at Gela, Patton issued hurried orders that sent 144 C-47 transport planes flying directly over the Allied fleet. The lack of communication, the failure to secure air corridors, and the chaotic state of the command led to a tragic slaughter as Allied anti-aircraft guns opened fire on their own men. 318 paratroopers were killed or wounded in this, the worst friendly fire disaster in modern American military history, a direct, documented consequence of the reckless, unchecked pace demanded by the command level. To understand why Patton was not court-martialed for his defiance at Palermo or his reckless orders at Gela, one must look at the mid-level administrative reality of the 1943 Military Code. The Articles of War of 1920, specifically Article 96, provided a broad, flexible authority that allowed for the prosecution of almost any conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. Yet, in the eyes of the High Command, the legal requirement to maintain discipline was constantly being weighed against the operational necessity of maintaining an aggressive leader. Eisenhower, acting within this legal gray area, practiced what could be termed discretionary command, choosing to manage Patton rather than remove him, effectively shielding his subordinate from the very statutes that were intended to govern his conduct. This period of the war was characterized by the complex interaction between operational control, OPCON, and administrative control, ADCON. While Patton was under the operational control of the Allied command, his ability to appeal to his national channels provided a critical safety valve that prevented an open revolt. This structural ambiguity was exactly what allowed figures like Patton to maneuver around directives. It was not just an issue of personality. It was a systemic feature of the coalition architecture that Eisenhower was forced to manage every single day. The post-war reconciliation of these events in memoirs like Crusade in Europe and A Soldier's Story reveals the extent of the institutional damage. Eisenhower attempted to frame the Sicilian campaign as a necessary test for a burgeoning coalition, downplaying the severity of the rifts. In contrast, Omar Bradley's critique in his memoirs, written with the help of Chester Hansen, was a scathing indictment of Patton's vanity, characterizing his actions as a desperate grab for glory at the expense of the strategic mission. Patton himself, in the posthumously published War as I Knew It, doubled down, reframing his insubordination as a form of moral courage needed to break the inertia of the European theater. The question persists. Was Patton's conduct the mark of a great leader or a flawed one? When we consider the lives lost due to poor communication and the strategic failure to trap the enemy forces, it becomes difficult to ignore the weight of his errors. Yet we are left with the undeniable reality that the same traits which led him to defy his superiors were the ones that broke the stagnation of the campaign. This is the central leadership dilemma. When does the drive for victory cross the line into a violation of the very order a commander is sworn to uphold? Consider the role of Colonel Bod, the German commander responsible for Operation Husky. His success was not due to some inherent German superiority, but to the Allies' self-inflicted blindness. If Eisenhower had enforced a more rigid command structure, could he have prevented the escape of the 40,000 professional German soldiers who later held the line at Salerno? The evidence suggests that a more disciplined, albeit less aggressive Brummel approach might have significantly altered the trajectory of the war in Italy. The tension between the professional, methodical Montgomery and the volatile, impulsive Patton serves as a case study for modern organizational leadership. In high-stakes environments, the friction generated by competing personalities is inevitable. The failure in Sicily was not the existence of this friction, but the inability of the higher command, specifically Alexander and Eisenhower, to synthesize these two disparate approaches into a unified operational doctrine. They allowed the rivalry to become the engine of the campaign, and that engine ultimately drove the Allied forces in the wrong direction. As we re-examine these events, we see that the records are not just historical data. They are warnings for contemporary commanders. Patton's garbled message defense is not just a clever anecdote. It is a profound lesson in how command structures can be manipulated by subordinates when accountability is diffused across a coalition. It serves as a reminder that the integrity of an organization is only as strong as the willingness of the leadership to enforce its own rules. By the time the campaign concluded, the damage was etched into the history of the coalition. The success in capturing Sicily was overshadowed by the operational incompetence displayed in the final stages of the withdrawal. The lesson was clear. Tactical brilliance, when untethered from strategic restraint, can lead to victories that are far more costly than defeats. The historical reality of the Sicilian campaign is a testament to the fact that wars are not won solely by individual geniuses. Patton, despite his immense capability, was a variable that Eisenhower could never fully control, and that lack of control cost the lives of thousands of soldiers who had to fight the same enemies over and over again in Italy. Is it possible that the entire Sicilian campaign was a strategic disaster dressed in the clothes of a tactical victory? The records we have today suggest that the answer is far more complex than the propaganda of the time would have had us believe. The struggle for command in Sicily was the crucible in which the Allied leadership for the invasion of Europe was finally forged, through failure, resentment, and a realization of the high price of unchecked ambition. Ultimately, the story of Patton and Montgomery in Sicily is a story about the fragility of unity. It reminds us that even when the strategic goal is aligned, the internal pressures of ego and doctrine can tear a command structure apart. The consequences of these decisions were not isolated to 1943. They echoed through the hills of Italy for the remainder of the war. The mystery of Sicily is finally resolved when we look not at the heroism, but at the cost. The cost of a race to Messina was the escape of an army that would fight the Allies for 2 more years. It was a victory, yes, but one that, had it been handled with just a fraction more discipline, might have ended the war in Italy much sooner. Do you believe General Eisenhower was right to keep Patton in command despite his documented failures in discipline? Or was his leadership style too dangerous for the long-term success of the Allied coalition? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.